you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall discuss the Road of Heaven. What are the philosophical roads of enlightenment adopted by Cainites to control the beast, to better help you roleplay faithfully religious characters? By now, you have probably got the idea that the roads and paths of enlightenment are a rigorous blend of strict code of conduct and spiritual edification, but no road is more bound to faith than the aptly named Road of Heaven. For the longest time, those who knew me well assumed I followed the Road of Heaven, not because I was born and raised during these times where the words of gods were law, but because of the faithful. The most common nickname for those who followed this road were often called nodists. Now you may be immediately confused by this. I can barely remember feeling the same thing. I was angry about it than you probably are, but that is neither here nor there. The reason why is fairly obvious when given a moment's thought. There is an ancient and holy piece of text called the Gospel of Laodicea, which I have somewhere that I will summarize for you. The principles of Via Ciale, the Road of Heaven, stem from Cain himself. He was cursed by God, but that puts him closer to God than any other kindred who has and ever will exist. Of course, Cain was certainly no faithful, as we have discussed in great detail before. The most faithful Cainite to God is meant to be Salot, who is considered the founder of the Road of Light, the original and now ancient name for this path. Salot and his progeny, his childer, embodied the way a holy Cainite was to live and was held with high regards by the faithful, even after his demise. We have discussed Salot before when we spoke about the Salubri some many moons ago, so you already know that he was somewhat of a martyr. He acted as a patron saint of sorts for the Cainites on this road, as was his child Samael. Many would look up to the Toreador Methuselah Michael, who dreamed of creating earthly heaven in Constantinople. He would subsequently form his own bloodline, the Niflheim, but they are a conversation for another night, perhaps. So to return to my original point, to study vampire and life, one must study Cain. To study Cain, you must aim to bring yourself closer to him and, in many circumstances, to God. I touched upon this momentarily, but there was once a time for hundreds of years where mortals are raised to respect and pay some sort of homage to their god, whoever that may be. I wish to make the distinction very early on that there is no main road of heaven with similar, less common paths. The road of heaven is made up of many different paths of various different beliefs and ethics to uphold. I will break them down for you later on in this discussion, but I wish to make you aware of the main three for now. The most common of the main paths was the path of Christ, which are followed by Christians and the many branches of that zealous tree. Those with Judaic beliefs followed the path of life, whilst those that believed in Islam stick to the path of the Prophet. Islamic kindred were usually members of the Ashira, especially devoted Jewish and pagan kindred are also commonly on this road. Regardless of faith, many who were once a devotee faithful to their deity or deities give up for many reasons. They feel punished by their god, becoming one of the damned, or perhaps coming to the conclusion that there is simply no god. Others feign their emotions, performing as the mortals do, whilst others just give up with no hard feelings. It takes a truly dedicated individual to follow through with their faith, which is how they stumble upon the Road of Heaven. I apologize, that was very poor wording on my part. One does not just find the Road of Heaven by mere happenstance, like one might the Road of Humanity or Beast. The faithful are usually incredibly careful who and what they embrace. It is very common for the weak-willed to lose themselves to the beast. The Road of Heaven had its fair share of adherents who were embraced on a whim or by mistake. They are no better than the other roads because they had the power of God on their side. The faithful would tell you differently, of course. It would be part of God's plan, whatever that may be. But I digress. Those who are chosen specifically to follow the Road of Heaven are known as salvation. At death, the child's embrace, their sins are washed away, granting them a clean slate, including the removal of the human morals that gives vampires a bad name. They are instructed that God's true believers are to feed upon the blood of mortals, sometimes before the embrace, but usually it is afterwards. Now this may puzzle you, as the drinking of blood would require those of Muslim faith to starve. It is the teachings that are followed, rather than the prescriptions, which have to be laxer as a result. Anyway, sires who tell their faithful child to be of their intentions are usually given the choice to find salvation via the embrace and be blessed, or remain with the mortal herd. They are made to forget the exchange via dominate, or are just killed, a practice often adopted by those who follow the path of divinity as part of their own rites, but I will elaborate on that later. With the mentioning of rites, mortals who choose to be embraced into the road of heaven partake in a ritual. The embrace is treated like a baptism of sorts, where the spiritual infancy, that is their mortality, is saved and their eyes are opened to God's earth. Different faiths treat this differently, which you probably surmised. Christian Cainites treat it as a second christening, for example. The same can be said for the ceremonies once the ritual is complete. Some study for nights upon nights, learning how to tame their beast, forcing it into submission, physically and spiritually, whilst those who believe in the Cainite hearsay that Jesus Christ is Cain were known to partake in blood orgies. No, you may not find one, you filthy animal. Anyway, these rituals vary from faith to faith, but what is usually the same throughout is that the initiate is brought to a synod, which is a council amongst the church, and recites a series of vows. These often take the form of prayers that are then recited every night for the rest of their existence, a vow to battle the forces of Satan and to obey the will of God, as is written in whatever holy book you are swearing to. The initiate takes confession, a process where the kindred pours their heart to the confessor, a process I heard can take several hours. This is followed by a rite known as the confirmation of blood, which follows the appropriate baptisms for each religious sect, but with blood. This is of course a very simplified version of the process, and for me to go on about each minute difference would have us be here all night, and I don't think either one of us wants that now, do we? What concludes the ceremony is communion, where an ashen priest of the path blesses the Cainite with a rite, which I've already mentioned is called the confirmation of blood, where the blood is said to symbolize God's grace and bounty, a source of spiritual nourishment that comes from not the urges of the beast, but from God. The blood presented is not enough to stave off the real hunger for any length of time, but it allows the faithful to remain sin-free, bolstering their spiritual strength. Pair this with a regular confession, and you will find this gives the faithful a moral advantage over their beast. It is often very difficult for anyone to keep their mouth shut once they have found their God, and that is no different for the Cainites. Well, Christian Cainites anyway. Pagan and Jewish kindred, for example, have more subtlety to their conversions. For some, it is business as usual to spread the word of their God to any and all who are prepared to listen. Some stick to a prince's domain, whilst others go on pilgrimages of sort, either to convert and to bring others into their flock via an actual pilgrimage, be it mortal or kindred. Very few would pass up the opportunity to bring the sinful damned into the road. What I have just described to you are given the title of missioners. Prayer is common for those within the road. Shocking, I know, but that's the truth. The required times for prayer are obviously missed, so one has to adapt and overcome. No, I do not mean forcing yourself to pray during the daylit hours. I have had some that have managed to do it, but for fuck's sake, child, no. Both the timings and prayers are altered to fit the condition that is the Cainite existence. Sometimes it involves quiet reciting or meditation, finished by a meal. They may even say grace before they tuck in. Anyway, Christian Cainites see this as them putting down the beast via flagellation, whilst the Asherah view this as putting the beast to sleep. Either way, missing just one night of prayer can cause the beast to stir. Much like a shepherd and his flock, the sire, known as the sponsor, spends time with the child during their early nights, guiding them on their chosen path. It is not a role taken lightly, especially when the sponsor has to convert the child to one faith to the next, or from no faith to faith. A sponsor can also reject the child at any time, which often results in the child being killed, which is most common if they come from another road and cannot be made to fall back to their old ways. The high and low clans were segregated, much like the rich and poor were. If a member of a high clan sponsored a low clan, it was seen as an act of kindness, like how Jesus helped the lepers. As for the inverse, well, they were crossing the line. This differed somewhat in the Middle East, where the Asherah ruled by the Banu Hakim, a low clan ruled supreme. Elders who were further along the road of heaven really couldn't give two shits. The need for penance in some form or another is vital. Redemption is found in almost all faiths, as is the need for performing acts of kindness. It is a strange concept for most mortals, let alone the power-hungry vampire, but it is possible. The Cainite must first realize they have sinned, and is often prepared to absolve their sin themselves. Should they try and justify their transgression, someone may have to point it out to them, thus reinforcing the act that the concept of community is ever so important. They can identify the sins of others and pull them back on track. Upon recognizing the sin, the Cainite has to confront it and then take action upon it, which is often the most difficult thing for the Cainite to do. Absolution can be painful also. Without some effort to correcting the wrong, one slides closer to the beast. One can do this with prayer, fasting, undertake pilgrimages for a more spiritual resolve, but one may have to provide for those who you did wrong. For example, say you lost control and you killed a man. It would be your job to find his family and help them however you can. Failure to do this constantly can cause one to degenerate and be kicked out of the road, branding you as a sinner at best and infernalist at worst. Why? Probably because they see the beast as a mark of the devil in this circumstance. I say probably, for no one really knows. It's not all peaceful divine spreading, you know. Evangelists are similar to the missioners, only their methods are more direct. They are the road's inquisitors, forcing others to listen and smiting the vilest of sinful transgressors. Again, this does not limit to the Christian faith. The Ashera have their own equivalent, known as the Masquerade. There is also the Leper Knights, Nosferatu, who were mortal knights in life who dedicated themselves to caring for the sick and slaying those who mean to do them wrong. The Order of the Chanticleer aims to uproot demonic influence, including but not limited to the smiting of barley, and the Unblooded, who are mostly salubri warriors who search for law and magic to help their cause of restoring the salubri to the once holy pinnacle. You could see this didn't exactly turn out how they planned. Anyway, the Salubri that created the Unblooded were followers of the path of retribution, whose goal is to punish the wicked and sinful. What makes these crusaders stand out from the evangelists is that they believe they are agents of divine justice, bringing down the light of heaven on earth, acting as a scourge of evil until the final night. They are the most organized within the Road of Heaven, and are initiated in via a rite called the Bloodening, becoming one of the right knights of his most order of vengeance. Yes, they do call themselves that, and they do take influence from the path of chivalry from the Road of Kings. The Salubri as a whole are more associated with the path of tears. The martyrs believe their duties imposed upon them by Cain includes the suffering and smiting of evil, originating with the destruction of the barley and whatever they serve. What makes this path separate from the path of retribution is that the martyrs do not believe they are the scourges of God. Yes, they fight whatever sinful adversaries in their way, but they will do it anyway, even if it includes sacrificing themselves. You would be hard-pressed to find any Western kindred following this path, for it was mostly associated with the Salubri and Assamites of the Ashera. Whilst these two paths destroy external sin, those who follow the path of pertinence are revolted by the sin that is themselves, truly believing it is a punishment from God. Many kindred believe that is the case. You know this, you live this. The penitents spend their unlives searching for atonement, hoping to win back God's grace and favour. Their prayers stand out from the parent road. Many refuse to feed, refusing blood for many nights, and even whip themselves. They are literally expected to beat their beast into submission, keeping it weak and tame it to avoid temptation. Whilst they seem quite solitary, they often act as the nocturnal guardians for mortal communities. Their numbers were few and far in between, with the Nosferatu taking up most of the ranks. On the flip side, those who follow the path of divinity believe they are blessed by God. The divinists are touched in a literal sense by the divine, and they stand out above and beyond all others. Yes, they are filled with venture and la sombre galore, which says all you need to know. Because of this unprecedented arrogance, the divinists are often seen as heretics, with others on the road and, by extension, God. Their practices, as hinted earlier, are seen as a mockery of the Catholic Church, using it as a literal weapon, a weapon that would soon be known as the Sabbat. On that note, there are those in the Sabbat who believe that they are God's dark angels, chalices in which the blood of sin might become the blood of salvation, instruments of his vengeance over the mortals. Vampires do not embrace the mortals, but the curse of Cain itself as a punishment for their sins. This is the basic description of what is known as the path of redemption. These new martyrs are taught to sacrifice the sun, love and God's grace, things they believe are most important to the mortal. The denial makes them stronger. A strong soul can purge the gates of heaven, gaining God's favour. As Sabbat Cainites, they embrace their vampirism to explore their full potential, but as agents of God. They do so because they believe they will learn more of God's plans. After all, God technically placed Cain under his protection so that none would harm him. Minus the curse and the archangels, but that's besides the point. This was done so Cain could seek forgiveness from God. It hasn't happened yet, so these vampires do it for him to win the favour of God. As a non-religious kindred, it is very difficult for me to discuss this road in great detail, for my heart is not really in it. My soul is dedicated to other purposes in life, and I feel that I have said a lot on very little. You may share the same ethos, or perhaps you expected me to break down each main religion and how Cainites have interpreted their mortal faith to survive. I can do this if there is a high demand for it, but at this time, I cannot do that, but there is something I hope you could take away from this. Kindred who focus their energy into the devotion of God, Allah, Jehovah, Yahweh, or whatever name your particular deities go by are not good vampires, something I try to emphasize during this discussion. Followers of these paths embrace those who have some faith left, which is not to be confused with true faith. The masses have forgotten God, with his teachings and ways once guiding the world. The faithful believe they can do that again, as they are, to them, the chosen ones, to guide kindred and kind alike into greatness. When I word it like this, it makes them sound like a deranged cult, which shouldn't surprise you because all religions are cults. Or are they? Hear me out. Our mythos dictates that God cursed Cain, whose childhood was cursed via the embrace and then again through the curse that I just mentioned. To that extent, God is with us all. By resisting the temptations of the beast, you become stronger and that bit closer to God. He, to the faithful, is the distant father, merciful yet strict. The whole world has disappointed him greatly with our weaknesses of lust and the sins that come with them, but we have the tools for salvation and the ways to accept God back into our hearts again. There may be no more angels in this world of darkness, so perhaps new messengers are needed to bring forth the light. Perhaps the faithful are to take up the mantle. Perhaps the vampires are the angels under heaven. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.